I've set up the single part of the hinge on the front piece of the locket. You can see I've done it in the same way as I did the back piece. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to heat the piece, spray it with some flux, and then I'm going to solder this with a little piece of hard solder. We'll get this piece heated up and then we'll get the flux on there. And you'll see again the flux helps to just keep everything in place. So now I've got that in place, I'm going to come in with a piece of hard solder just in between the back plate and the hinge. Get the little piece of tube for the hinge. And again, we're just going to concentrate the heat around the whole piece until both pieces come up to heat and that solder should flow. So we'll watch for the flux to start to go a bit glassy, and then we should see that solder flow. That's the back section of the hinge on. So what we'll do is take the binding wire out once this is cooled down and then pop that in the pickle, and then we'll come back and we'll solder the two pieces for the clasp. What I'm going to do now is solder another small piece of tube onto the opposite side of the locket from the hinges. I'm putting this piece onto the back of the locket, so this single piece of tube is going onto the same side or the same piece of the locket as the double hinge. And what we'll do with this is use this to create the hinged part of the clasp for this locket to keep it snapped together. So I've just propped up the tube on a little piece of copper, that's just to raise it up off the block. I'm going to warm the whole piece, I'm going to use some spray flux, and then I'm going to come in and solder this piece of tube, and I'm going to use some easy solder this time. So I'm just going to get the piece nice and warm. And get some of the flux on there. You can see that that covers it with a nice white coating. And then I'm going to come in with a piece of easy solder and just drop that so it sits between the tube and the locket back. And I'm going to heat the back of the locket more than the tube because this is the bigger piece. And sort of move the flame across both pieces. With this being propped up on a piece of copper, this will actually help as well, so it draws the heat away from that small piece of tube. But I'm still concentrating more on the back of the locket, and you can see that the flux is starting to change colour. So I'm going to drop it down, and you can see that that solder has flowed, and that should be nice and attached to the back of the locket. So I'll pop that piece in the pickle, and then I'll set up the front of the locket to put the other part of the catch onto. The back of our locket has come out of the pickle now, and what I'm going to do is line that up with the front of the locket so that we can mark where we need to put the other half of the clasp. So this is the part that's going to help keep the locket together when it's being worn. So here's the front half of our locket, and we'll just pop the back piece on. You can just put that together so that the hinge clicks into place, and then we'll turn that over, and we can make sure that where we're going to solder the front part of the clasp is going to line up with the back. So I'm just going to pop that down, and it's going to stay in place because of the hinge at the back. So for the front, part of the clasp, I'm just going to use a little piece of silver that I have balled up, and that's going to go on the front there, and then we'll use a piece of wire and form a little clasp to go across that. So I think that needs to go roughly there. And what I'm going to do is just pop a little Sharpie mark on so that I know where to set that up to solder. Just get in and keep hold of that. There we go. Just double check, make sure that's about central. Okay. So again, I'm just going to use some pieces of scrap copper to support the piece that I'm going to solder onto this side. So I'll just get that set up, and then we can come back and solder that little granule onto the front. I've got my little piece of balled up silver resting against my locket. I've just used again some pieces of scrap copper to keep that in place. Once again, I'm going to come in, heat the piece, use some spray flux, and then I'm going to use some easy solder to solder the little granule onto the locket. Okay, so let's just pop a little piece of easy solder. Just drop that so that it's touching both pieces. We're going to come in and just heat this up gently until that solder flows. We should keep that granule. On the locket. It looks like that jumped up onto the top of that granule, so I'm just going to add another little piece of solder. And I'll try and get that to flow through rather than jump. So just keep directing the heat around the piece. There we go. So that solder flowed, and it's flowed underneath that granule, which means that that should be nice and adhered to the piece. I'm going to pop that in the pickle, and then we'll show you how to rivet the hinge and just create the little wire part of the clasp. We've now got the hinges on both of the locket pieces. It's got the double hinge on one side, that's the back half of the locket, and then we've got the single hinge on the front side of the locket. I've got the two sections of the clasp soldered, so we've got the tube on the rear of the locket and we've got the little granule on the front. So the final bit of soldering that we need to do for this locket is to just add a jump ring to the back so that we can attach it to a chain. Just going to move this around a bit so that I can set it up for the jump ring. I'm going to use a jump ring made from half round wire, which is quite a nice chunky feel to it. Before I solder this to the back of the locket, I'm just going to file a flat spot across the jump ring just so that it makes it easier to solder. The easiest way to do that is to hold the jump ring in a pair of pliers. I'm using parallel pliers because then you can put equal pressure on across all of the jump ring and it's less likely to fly out when you're trying to file it. and I'm going to just use a flat file to go across the top. It's only going to take a few passes, and then that will make a nice spot that we can solder to the back of the locket. So that's going to wobble. Okay, so you can see that there's now a flat spot filed onto the top of the jump ring, and now we're going to set it up so that we can solder it to the back of the locket. So because this is a fairly chunky jump ring, we won't need to worry about supporting it underneath. You can see this is in the centre between the hinge and the clasp at the front. So I'm going to heat this piece, I'm going to flux it, and then I'm going to solder this on with a piece of easy solder. Just get that heated. And get some flux in there. And then I'm just going to pop a piece of easy solder in between the jump ring and the locket. We'll wait for that flux to bubble up. Might just need to nudge that back into place if it's moved when the flux bubbled. And just use the tweezers to move that solder down to where we wanted it. I feel like that's jumped across onto that jump ring a little. That's no problem, we'll just add another little bit of solder and just continue to heat and pull that down. And there we go, that should have soldered the jump ring to our locket. So I'll pop that into the pickle, and then we'll come back and we will rivet and then create the wire part of the clasp. We've now got the jump ring attached to the top of our locket, and we've got the hinge ready to rivet. So to do this, I'm going to use a piece of 0.8mm silver wire. You could use 0.9, I just find 0.8 easier to get through. Even though this is a 1mm inside diameter, I find that it's easier to put a slightly smaller gauge wire through than trying to force through exactly the same gauge wire as the internal diameter of the tube. So to create my rivet, I'm going to actually use the torch to ball up one end of this wire. Then I will feed it through the hinge, and then we'll rivet the other end, we'll trim it and rivet the other end. So you'll end up with the ball at one end and then a flat rivet at the other. So just move the locket out of the way. And you can do this using your hand torch. Just going to turn that around slightly. So I'm going to hold the silver in my tweezers, switch the torch on, I'm going to just heat that very gently, and then you need to hold this so that the silver is in the flame. And you'll see the colour start to change, and then the silver will just start to ball up. There we go, you can see it starting to go. We'll just get that up a bit further. There we go. And there we've got our balled up piece of silver. So I'm just going to wait for that to cool down, and then we can use this to create the rivet for the hinge. So I'll pop that down onto steel block, and that should take a few seconds to cool down. Okay, this is cooled down now. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a clean with some micro mesh. It's not too badly oxidized. If it was, I'd drop it into the pickle for a few minutes to just clean it up, but we'll just use some micro mesh and that should get it clean. Okay, I'll just give that a little bit of a rub through there. There we go, that's great. So that's nice and clean again. So to create the rest of the rivet, what we're going to do is feed this through the hinge. It might be a little bit tricky to get through, you just need to manoeuvre it around. I'll try it from the other side. Sometimes this goes through easier from one side than the other. That's going through. If it's a bit tricky to get this through just using your fingers, you can use a pair of pliers to try and push this through, because this is quite a long piece of wire, and obviously because we've heated it up it's going to become soft, which means it can start to bend while it's inside the hinge. As you can see, it's quite soft. There we go, so that's pulled through to the other side. Okay, I'm going to just turn this and I'm going to use my pliers to just pull this all the way through. And you can see that that butts up nicely at the bottom. There we go, we can see that that hinge opens and closes nicely. So the next thing to do is to trim this wire down, and I want to trim it down so that there's only about the thickness of the wires sticking up as the length. So this is 0.8 mil thick, so I want less than 1 mil sticking up at the top here, and that should form a good rivet. So I'm going to just use a pair of flush cutters and just turn this slightly. I'm going to take this down about here, so you can see that I'm taking out quite a lot of the length. There you go. So you can see there's only a small amount sticking out here. I'm just going to quickly smooth that off with a needle file, just to make sure that that edge is nice and flat. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is use a riveting hammer, which is quite a small hammer. I'm going to put the bald part of the rivet onto the top of my bench peg. I'm going to use that to brace the rivet in place, and then I'm just going to hammer the top section with my riveting hammer, and that will start to flare that wire out, so it'll trap it, so it's not going to come out of the tube. So you can see we've got that braced against the peg, so I'm putting some downward pressure onto the locket to make sure that this is staying in place, and I'm going to use the flat face of the hammer to just start riveting. When you're riveting, you don't want to just hammer in a straight downward motion. You want to be sort of spreading the metal out, so hammering as if you're kind of stroking off to one side often helps. you can just move the piece around. You can see that's starting to hammer out. I'm going to turn and use the pointed back of the riveting hammer. So this is like a ball peen hammer or cross peen hammer, and then I'm going to hammer it so it fills in that gap. If you've got a hammer hand piece, you can also use that to rivet with. So that looks like it should be okay. And we'll just check to see that that still opens. Okay, that's still going to open and close, and that should stay in place. So the last thing that we need to do is add the wire at the front here to create the clasp. So I will set that up and then I'll come back and show you how to do that.